All right, good Friday morning to everyone. I hope where you are, it is as beautiful as a beautiful day as what we're experiencing here in Sitka. I want to welcome all of you for this to this session on uh, entitled "Steps for Uprooting Racism, Privilege, and Institutional Inequity" by Tim Wise. First, though, let me start by recognizing that we are on Tlingit Ani. Ani is the Tlingit word for land, and the Tlingit people have been in this place for over 10,000 years. It's very important to recognize this historical fact and to appreciate that the Tlingit people have been excellent stewards and have lived out the traditional tribal values around balance, respect, and caring for the earth that sustains us all. So, for taking wonderful care of this special place for time immemorial, we say thank you and Gunas Chis. Again, welcome all of you for being here. Many of you, if not most of you, have this is a return experience for you, having participated in the public workshop yesterday. I am going to give a little bit more of an introduction to Tim than was given yesterday. This is actually Tim's fourth trip to Alaska. He's been to Anchorage a couple times, or Fairbanks a couple times, Anchorage once, and now in Sitka, only virtually though. So we're going to have to make arrangements for Tim to join us when the COVID has been lifted, or the challenges that we're experiencing have been lifted, because especially on a day like this, we certainly want to show off the beautiful place that we all live in. A few things about Tim. Tim is one of the nation's most prominent anti-racism educators and authors. He spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states on over 1,500 colleges and high school campuses, and hundreds of professional and academic conferences, dozens of corporations and community groups across the country about issues such as we're discussing today: systemic racism and methods for dismantling racial inequity in their institution. Tim is author of 9 books, including one that's coming out in December entitled Dispatches from the Race War. Other books including Dear White America, Letters to a New Minority, and his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues, and has appeared on ABC's 2020 and Nightline, as well as CBS Sunday Morning and 48 Hours. He's graduated from Tulane University. He spoke about that yesterday, and he's received anti-racism training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. So with that, I want to give him as much time as possible. We are going to be here for an hour. The last 10 or 15 minutes will be available for questions. Just a few housekeeping details. If you have a question that you would like addressed to the speaker, do not chat with him personally. He's not looking at his chat. So, but we do want his questions to come to him so he has a chance to respond to us. But if you go to the chat box and just look for ask a question and send the question there, and it will eventually get to me, and I will ask the question on behalf of you. Would ask you, for the sake of the recording, that you turn off your video. I'm going to turn my video off as soon as I'm done speaking. It'll save on bandwidth. Also ask you to do as I'm going to do as soon as I'm done here, is mute my my Zoom here. So if you could turn off your video and mute, that'll help. This session will be recorded, and will be made available in a few weeks. We will let you know via email how to access that email or how to access the recordings. I know we are in competition with the Board of Regents and other meetings going on that happen at the beginning of the semester. So I've already been contacted by several people saying, oh, I really am sad I'm not able to attend, but when is a recording going to be available? So we'll let you know. So with that, I'm going to close my mouth and turn the session over to Tim. So Tim, on behalf of all of us in Southeast Alaska, we say welcome, and we look forward to learning from you in these next several minutes. So thank you again.
Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks to all of you, anyone on the call that was involved in making it possible for me to be with you, even if only virtually, better than nothing. Definitely was looking forward to coming and being there in person before the lockdown took place, but it is good to be able to chat with you, albeit briefly. Today we don't have a ton of time, but I can give you at least some of the sort of analytical framework for thinking about race and equity issues within higher ed. And then hopefully when we get on the other side of COVID-19, would love to be able to come and explore these issues more deeply with you. And if we can get another day like the one you're getting there today, from what I understand, that would be great as well. Although I don't mind rain. Heard you get a lot of rain. I actually like rain, so I'll come there at any time. Not a problem for me. A couple of things real quick up front, just so you know. I said this yesterday in the community-wide event that I was doing there as well. I am not a technological genius. This is an understatement of somewhat biblical proportions. So there is every possibility that I'm going to hit a button, knock my microphone over, do something, get too excited and exuberant about what I'm saying to you, and make a mistake, end up knocking myself off of line and having to get back on. If it happens, I will get back on. I've got the Zoom link, so don't go anywhere. If there's a technical glitch, I'm pretty confident it will be on my end, not yours. You've got several people there who know what they're doing, and I've got me, and that's usually not good. We also, like I said, don't have a lot of time, so we're not going to be able to probably fully explore all the things that I'd love to be able to explore, but I think sometimes it's helpful just to be able to get a common language for thinking about issues. And I think we can do that work in the time that we have today, sort of have a common framework and a common language and a common lens that hopefully we can then, going forward there in your community, as well as all the other communities to which I speak throughout the course of the year, a lens that we can all use when we discuss issues of race and inequality in higher education. We are, of course, right now in an incredibly amazing, I suppose, also, stressful time in this country, in part because of COVID, obviously, but also in part we're in the midst of the largest racial justice uprising, quantitatively speaking, in the history of the country. And I would say in part that's because of the racial disproportionality of COVID and the impact of that on all of us around the country, really helping us focus attention on some of the horrors that so many folks, in particular Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color, have been dealing with for so long in terms of health disparities and broader inequities. But also, of course, the problem of law enforcement violence in Black and brown communities, which has come into such stark relief for millions of people who perhaps previously have, as I've often said, hit the snooze button on that particular alarm clock, even though that alarm has been going off for many, many generations. So now we're all sort of focused on this issue. And you have institutions from colleges, to corporations, to nonprofit groups, government agencies, sort of coming out of the woodwork, trying to get involved, trying to ask, what do we do to create greater equity? And on the one hand, that's fantastic. On the other hand, as I said yesterday, it always makes me a little nervous when folks who maybe had been hitting that snooze button suddenly want to figure out, how do we fix this problem? Because previously, they had sort of been sleeping on that problem. Now, I'm not one to judge you if you're late to the party. As long as you come and you get involved in the struggle for a more just society, I'm all for it, whether you're late or not. But it does make me a little nervous sometimes when institutions suddenly take up this mantle, because this is long-term work. This is not the kind of thing that we can just plug in, a PowerPoint presentation and give you the 1 through 10 sort of 5-year plan or 2-year plan for undoing racism. This is a problem that's been coming for hundreds of years. in this place that we call the United States. And it manifests in different ways in different communities, manifests differently there than it does here in Nashville, where I am, differently than in New Orleans, where I spent many of my formative years, different than it would in all parts of the country. So we have to really think about this as a long-term project for undoing inequality. And I think sometimes we're very quick to look for the quick fix because we live in a society that encourages that, right? If you have a headache, you take a pill, right? If you want to lose weight really quick, there's pills you can take for that. If you, whatever problem you have, we sort of have these quick fixes. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but the mentality is the mentality of the quick fix, right? And this is a problem for which there is no quick fix. And that's obvious, right? Because for hundreds of years, we keep having this conversation. I've been on the road for 25 and I've been doing anti-racism work for 30. And in many ways, the conversations that we have in this country, even though they're ramped up to a higher level now quantitatively, the subject matter basically is the same year after year, generation after generation, Black and brown peoples all around the country demanding justice, and some white folks joining in that and lots of others sort of ignoring the call for justice. What is it about this problem of racial inequity that seems to bedevil us so much as a society, so that we have to keep coming back, having that same conversation? Because it's sort of weird if you think about it. I mean, we're all mostly good people, I think. I think most folks are, pretty decent people. I don't think most people want to hurt others. I don't think most people wake up every morning and think about oppressing or holding other people down. I think most people are pretty good folks who want the best for everyone. But in spite of our best intentions, and in spite of the fact that we're mostly pretty smart, you're in higher ed, you're in these institutional spaces, you're a smart person, you're a caring person, a compassionate person, a well-intended person. And yet, in spite of our best intentions, in spite of our intelligence, in spite of our, scholarly backgrounds and all of our intentionality, we continue to have these inequities creep up within higher ed, as well as the labor market, the healthcare delivery system, the housing market, the criminal justice system. So in spite of all of that, we keep having this problem. That tells us that it's a long-term problem, and a long-term problem, a deeply embedded, systematized problem, is going to require long-term, deeply embedded, systematized answers, right? Not going to be handled with a few little tweaks here and there. It's not going to be handled with a little bit more money for training, or a little bit of reform in these little parts of the institution. We're going to have to really rethink a lot of what we currently believe and a lot of what we currently do, because this problem is exactly what so many have been saying it is ever since this uprising began. It is systemic. And I want to sort of make sure we understand what is meant by that, because I think sometimes we think about systemic racism and we assume, or some do, that we're sort of accusing everyone of being racist and bigoted and mean-spirited. And in fact, the thing about systemic racism is it doesn't require that at all. It means the opposite, actually. Systemic racism can exist even without any overt bigotry, even without any overt racism in the institutional space. That may seem odd. How do you have racism without racists, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva at Duke University says in his works? But it isn't that difficult to imagine, because we have institutions that have policies and they have practices and procedures and sort of operational ways of doing things that can perpetuate inequality, even without intentionality. We know that's true in the labor market, right? We know that one of the ways people get jobs in this country generally is through the old boys network, more about who they know than what they know. And we know, because the research tells us, how that leads to racial inequity, gender inequity, class inequity, because the people who tend to be in those networks and know about various opportunities tend to be like the ones who are already in those institutional spaces. So even if you don't have any bigots in the workforce, if networking is critical to getting jobs and opportunities, that's going to perpetuate racial inequity, which is systemic racism. Within the world of education, we have a system very unique in the Western world that sort of over relies on standardized testing from the time we're like in first grade. We start giving kids standardized tests, right? And we don't do it for the reason that you might expect would be valid, right? Which is, sometimes you want to give people tests to find out where they are in their process. How are we delivering the information? Are people getting what it is we're teaching? That's a good reason to test people, to give a standardized test to see, hey, are we falling down on the job with these kids or these young adults or these young adults? That's not what we do with standardized tests. We actually use them as gatekeeping mechanisms, right? So we give everybody a test that's standardized, even though they come from unstandardized backgrounds, went to unstandardized K-12, had unstandardized family situations, unstandardized wealth and income, had unstandardized curricula in the schools they attended with unstandardized teacher training. And we give them all a standardized test, and we use that to then divvy up where they're going to go, or if they're going to go anywhere after they graduate from high school. And of course, we're giving them those tests sometimes even to graduate from high school. And so that too, because of the overlap between race and economic status and the way that those things affect the resources available to students of color around the country, be they Black, Indigenous, or other folks of color, that then has a racially disparate impact. Doesn't require that any teachers be racist in the formal sense. It doesn't require that any principal be racist, or any admissions officer at a college, or any college counselor, or any college professor, or the folks at the college board, right? I know the guy who's the head of the educational testing service that does the SAT. I know him. He's not a racist in any overt sense, but he's part of a system of testing that perpetuates inequality. So systemic racism is something that we want to think about in a much broader way than we're normally used to thinking about the subject. Getting out of our heads the idea that we're talking about bad people. I mean, there are bad people, but the point is even good people can find themselves caught up in bad systems. And if you're a good person with good intentions caught up in a bad system, whether that's schools, whether that's the justice system, the labor market, whatever it is, you can find yourself transformed by that bad system and defeated by that bad system often more easily than you'll defeat the system or change it. There are lots of people who go into law enforcement with the best of intentions as well, but we know from the research on this that so often when they try to stand up against corruption or against brutality or against discriminatory treatment by their partners and others on the force, they're the ones who get run out of policing, right? Because there's an institutional set of practices that end up trumping, no pun intended, given the current political context, end up trumping people's good intentions. So we need to think about racism in a systemic way and think about how we can begin to unspool that. And specifically, of course, today we're talking about that in the context of higher education. I think if we're going to be able to unspool institutional and systemic inequity in higher ed, we have to let go of a few illusions that are keeping that inequity in place. And we need to adopt some practices that we sometimes overlook or don't think about, which might help move us in a different direction. So I'm going to talk broadly about both of those things. What are the things we need to relinquish, the mindsets that we need to change, and then what's the mindset or mentality that we need to adopt? Obviously, changing the mindset and the mentality is not enough. There are hardcore policies and procedures we have to do as well. That's the kind of stuff we would have to talk about if we had 3 or 4 hours or a full day to discuss it. But at least we can get the framing right. Because if we frame the problem correctly, then we've got a shot at coming up with some of those answers. If we frame it incorrectly, we could spend weeks and months and years trying to come up with the answers, and we won't find them. If you don't ask the right questions, whatever answers you get probably won't be right. So here are a couple of things that I want us to think about. First, as someone who is trained teachers and educators from kindergarten all the way up through graduate school level, medical school, law school, one of the things that I think you hear more often than any other articulated view on the part of educators, professional educators, and I think it's very noble. I think it's very sweet when people say it, but I think we don't question it enough or interrogate it enough, is when I ask people why they got into education, why they became teachers, why they became principals, why they wanted to be a professor, why they wanted to be involved in the sort of system of education. A lot of times what they will say, and what lots of people will say, you ask people about education generally, what they'll say is, well, the great thing about education is that it's the great equalizer. If we can just, get people educated, that's going to equalize our society. The idea being that the reason we don't have equity now is because we're falling short at this. We have this really good intention. We have this system that if we just did it right, we'd have equity, but we're failing. We're falling down on the job somehow. And we just need to try harder because education is this thing that is an equalizer in American society. Now, the problem with that mentality is, of course, all the evidence historically tells us that it's never been that, right? That it's never actually functioned as a great equalizer. In fact, we know right now that Black folks, Latinx folks, and indigenous folks who have college degrees, who did everything right and got that college degree, are still between 50% and 85% more likely than white folks with degrees to be out of work, even though they have a degree also, even if it's in the same academic department, by the way. So Latinx folks with a degree in whatever department, about 50% more likely than whites with the same degree to be out of work. Indigenous folks with a degree, about 75% more likely than comparable whites to be out of work. Black folks with a degree, about 85% more likely than comparable whites to be out of work. So in fact, education isn't really equalizing. Now, one might say, well, that's because we're just not quite doing it right. If we just tweak a few things, maybe we would. But the problem with that is that argument sort of assumes that the purpose of education is actually equalization. And although I think it's a nice thing to think, and it sounds very nice, this idea that that's the purpose, maybe we're not fulfilling the purpose, but that's the purpose, that ignores the actual history of education in our country. And it ignores what the people who created that system and maintained that system, developed that system, told us they were doing. You see, there are folks who created our educational system as we know it in the United States, and they were very clear about what its purpose was. And its purpose was never equality or anything even remotely like it. We know this because we can go back and we can listen to what Thomas Jefferson, for instance, said about the purpose of education. He was, in his time, considered a very forward-thinking educational theorist. He was considered a very progressive thinker around the importance of schooling. He founded the University of Virginia, of course. And in his famous writing, Notes on the State of Virginia, one of the things he said, now keep in mind, he was only talking about white people. He wasn't thinking about indigenous folks or Black folks or anyone of color whom obviously he had no intention of education for those folks. He didn't think about them at all. He was just talking about white folks. And what he said was that the purpose of education was really the opposite of equality. He said, what we need about 5 or 6 years of compulsory education. So, everybody go to like 5th or 6th grade, I guess, was a big deal in the 1780s, perhaps. So everybody get 5 or 6 years of education so that we can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish, right? The idea being that if you get 5 or 6 years of schooling in there, we can figure out who's really the genius and who's not, right? Which is in and of itself questionable. But the bigger problem with this statement is what he's saying is the point of schooling is to separate the geniuses from the rubbish. The idea being the rubbish will work for the rest of us because, of course, we're the smart ones. We're going to run stuff. Y'all can do the hard physical labor, right? And he's just talking about white people. Needless to say, he didn't have any intentions for indigenous folk and Black folk to become formally educated. But even with regard to white folk, he was saying, yeah, the point of schooling is definitely not to be the great equalizer. It's the opposite of that, right? And you might think, well, that's a long time ago. Maybe that mentality changed. But then you come a little bit further into the present. You see Woodrow Wilson in the early part of the 20th century. He was, of course, president of the United States as well. But before that, he was president at Princeton. And he, too, was considered a very thoroughgoing, sort of forward-thinking, somewhat progressive educational theorist at the time. And what he said was very similar to Jefferson. He said, what we really need in this society, according to Wilson, he said, we need one group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education. That was the term they used to use for college. Right? One group to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education, and another group, much larger, he said, by necessity in this and every other society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. Right? So in other words, he's sort of saying what Jefferson was saying over 100 years after Jefferson said his version of it. He's saying, look, what we really need is like a handful of folks to run stuff, and the rest of y'all are going to lift the heavy things that we're too good to lift. You're going to do the sweaty work, the difficult work. We're going to sort of just run the world. Hope y'all don't mind. Like the purpose of education, once again, was inequality by design. And again, Woodrow Wilson was not even remotely thinking of Black and brown people there. He's just really talking about white folks. He's saying, even with regard to white folks, most of y'all are sort of like Jefferson said, rubbish. Most of y'all are going to do hard physical labor. You don't deserve the privilege of higher education. Now, perhaps one would say, okay, but that's 100 years ago too. Like, surely it's different. Well, maybe not, because then in the early 2000s, not so long ago at all, about 20 years ago, not quite, after George W. Bush had become president and they passed the No Child Left Behind Act, right, the big educational reform package during the Bush administration, William Bennett who was the former Secretary of Education under Reagan. He was also the drug czar. Didn't do either of these jobs real well, but he had both of them. So apparently you can get two mediocre, you can do two jobs mediocre if you're a rich white conservative guy. But Bill Bennett was the Secretary of Education under Reagan. He's on one of the Sunday talk shows talking about this new educational reform package, the No Child Left Behind law. And the interviewer asks him a question, says, Mr. Secretary, what do you think, as the former Secretary of Education, what do you think the biggest problem facing American education today is? That's one of those big, weighty questions, right? Like, I'm not even sure I would know what the best answer to that is. I might ask to go to a commercial break or something, because I might want to think about it. Like, there's 7 or 8 things I could pick, but I don't want to just pop off the top of my head. Let me think about it. Bill Bennett didn't even need to think about it. Bill Bennett had an answer. He was ready. You know what his answer was? It wasn't inadequate funding, right? It wasn't giving standardized tests to unstandardized kids. It wasn't resource inequality. It wasn't any of that. He said the biggest problem is we have too many people going to college, right? Not too many people going to college who can't afford it because it's too damn expensive. That would have been a pretty good answer. Not too many people going to college that aren't adequately prepared because we've shortchanged them in K-12. That would have been a pretty good answer. No. He just had a period at the end of the sentence, not a comma, not a dash, not a semicolon, nothing, just a period that said too many people are going. Now, who is he talking about, right? Who does he mean? He doesn't say who he means, but who do we think he means, right? If you're saying too many people are going, we sort of know who you're not talking about, right? The people who've always gone, you're not questioning them. They've always gone. So if you're rich, right, and for the most part, affluent, upper middle class white folks, doesn't matter. They could be mediocre college students. He's not questioning them. They could have been mediocre high school students. He's not questioning them. There are a lot of really mediocre rich people. I've met them, right? I've spoken at prep schools. People at Groton and Choate and Exeter, they do get C's. Some people barely graduate, but I doubt that Bill Bennett is recommending that we go to these kids who go to East Coast prep schools, sit them down and say, oh man, I know you really had your heart set on college and maybe being a doctor like your dad, but have you ever thought about working in a factory? Because your grades suggest to me that maybe med school is above your pay grade, right? He doesn't expect us to do that. You could be a C or a D student at a prep school with the right connections, and they all know you're going to college. So when Bill Bennett says too many people are going, he's not talking about the rich and mediocre. He's talking about the folks who are going now who maybe weren't going a generation ago, or 2 generations ago, or 3 generations ago. Who are they? Well, they're working class folks of all colors, and they're folks of color, disproportionately working class, who wouldn't have perhaps gone in previous generations. He's talking about black and brown folks, whether he says it or not. Sort of the mentality of the slave owner, really, right? Which was a mentality that said, hey, if all these folks learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton, right? If all these folks learn to read, who's going to do the physical labor that Woodrow Wilson was talking about? If everybody learns to read, if everybody gets an education, how are we going to know who the geniuses are and who the rubbish are, using Jefferson's terms? So what all these folks are saying is that the point of education really is not equality, it's inequality. Why am I giving you that brief history lesson, right? There's more we could talk about with regard to that. But I'm telling you that because if we start with the assumption that the system is a great equalizer and that we're failing right now, then we're starting from a false premise. The system isn't failing. Actually, the system is producing exactly the outcomes for which it was created, according to the people who created it and sustained it and gave it life over the period of 200 plus years, who basically said the point was inequality. So if they're telling you the purpose is inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunity and inequality of access, then when you see inequality, you can't think of that as a system failure. Right? If the system was never set up for you in the first place and it proceeds to then not serve your interests, that's not failure. That is success on the terms of the system itself. Now, we may not like acknowledging that, but that doesn't change the fact that it's true. That means we have to commit to changing the system. And that means relinquishing this mindset of failure to realize that actually the system is functioning as it was designed. Now, let's be very clear. I don't mean that as a conspiratorial kind of thing. It's not the Wizard of Oz behind a curtain trying to deliberately hurt folks. Like I said, I think most folks are good and aren't trying to hurt people deliberately. But if you have a system, the machinery of which was programmed to produce inequality, you can't be shocked when that's what it gives you, right? It's like if you think of it as a telephone app or whatever, right? It's not a glitch. It's a feature. It's built into the app. There's no patch coming, right? There's no update coming unless we create the update. So the first and foremost thing we have to do is relinquish this mythology of education as an equalizer and say to ourselves, if we want to make it that, because it was never intended to be that, we have to start over somewhat from scratch. You're not going to be able to just sort of tinker with the parts and the gears and the machines, because the conveyor belt is still headed where the conveyor belt is headed, metaphorically speaking, right? There's another thing we have to think about if we're going to create equity. And I think it gets in our way of doing it, maybe consciously, maybe subconsciously. And that is that we live in a society that has this sort of cornerstone belief system that perpetuates inequality and makes it very hard for us to commit to challenging it. What do I mean? Well, here's the thing. I don't care whether you live in Alaska or you live in Florida. So we think about sort of two, sort of catty corner parts of the United States, very, very far removed. Or if you live in Hawaii or you live in Maine, another example of great, geographic disparity. Doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter your racial or ethnic or cultural background, religious background, socioeconomic background. There's one thing that I know we were all taught in this country. We might have had other things that we were taught that were different from family, from teachers, from friends, but there's one thing that we all picked up and we were taught, whether it was from our family, whether it was from teachers, whether it was from religious figures, politicians, or we just picked it up from the media. And that is the cornerstone building block of American ideology, this notion of rugged individualism, meritocracy, right? The idea that wherever I end up is all about my own effort. So anybody can make it in America, which means if you made it, it's because you clearly were the best, you had the talent, you had what it took, you worked hard. If you didn't make it, must be something wrong with you. Now, in theory, that mentality doesn't necessarily have anything to do with race. But in practice, if you take that ideology, which is the secular gospel of the country in which we live, right, more so than any other society in the history of the world, most societies didn't operate on that, right? The feudal European societies from which white folks in America come, by and large, they didn't have that. They were feudal systems. There was no notion of rugged individualism. It's like, dude, you're either related to the king or you're not. If you're not, you're a peasant. You're screwed. Like the only chance you have is a revolution. And everybody knew it. But in this country, we've said, oh, no, you don't have to overthrow the king, so to speak. You just got to work harder. You work in 40 hours a week, work 50. You work in 50, work 60, right? Double down, triple down, work harder. Something's wrong with you. It's a genius mentality, really, for keeping people in their place, because what it does is it says, if you're not making it, if you're not doing well in school, if you don't have enough money, if you can't pay for healthcare, if you're sweating rent and unable to pay a mortgage, it must be a failing in you or your people. Your culture must not care enough about education. So that way we can desystematize the whole analysis and say, oh, it's not our problem. It's your deficit. It's your problem. And then we rationalize the inequality. When you take that argument about rugged individuality and meritocracy and you put it on top of a society with profound racial inequality, what do you think the default position of people is going to be when they look at that inequality? The default position will be, well, I guess those people on the bottom of the pile, they just don't have what it takes. Nothing we can do about that. Oh, well. And then we hit that snooze button on the alarm again, right? We do that with regard to income inequity, health disparities. We're seeing it now with COVID. Folks who were saying, well, people are going to die, but it's people with pre-existing conditions. What do it's not like healthy people, which is a really horrific mentality, right? Basically saying these people are disposable. They have diabetes, even though diabetes totally manageable. Asthma, I have asthma. Well, they have asthma. Asthma is totally manageable unless you get a disease that attacks your lungs, in which case it's not. In which case it can kill you. But that mentality of disposability, that mentality is essentially rooted in that same idea of rugged individualism and meritocracy. Because if you're sick, the question must be, well, what did you do? Did you not eat right? Did you not exercise? You didn't have a gym membership? What's wrong with you? You didn't do CrossFit? You smoke cigarettes? You drink every now and then? It's your own fault. You should have taken better care of yourself. That is a mentality that millions of people have ingested either at a conscious or a subconscious level, because it is the secular gospel of America. If this country were a Bible, it would be Genesis 1:1, right? That wherever you end up is your own fault. Unless we challenge that, and we can only do that if we're willing to talk about systemic inequities, talk about the history of the country and how it led us to this place. If we don't do that, we're never really going to take aim at inequality, because we're going to be justifying it. Maybe not consciously, because we know it sounds terrible, some of us, to say that. But subconsciously, there's always going to be this voice in the back of our heads that says, what are you going to do for these people? I mean, really, come on, right? They have a deficit. The problem is them. So we have to relinquish that mentality as well. And that's hard, right? Because to challenge the fundamental ideology of Americanism is like going to a church and immediately after the preacher or the priest stops the Sunday sermon, raising your hand in the third pew and like, yeah, it was great, but, there's no such thing as God. Doesn't generally go over very well with the other parishioners, right? And the same is true when you challenge the fundamental building block of American ideology. It can be very, very difficult to do, even though all of history tells us that it isn't true. And if you've got the architects of American education telling you it isn't true, telling you, what are you talking about? Meritocracy? Right? Anybody can make it if they try. No, we created a system that was about some folks not making it. Know that. They're telling you that's what it was. And if we continue to insist that that's what it is against all evidence, then we're never going to get where we need to go. So what are the mentalities that we need, the sort of analytical framework that we need instead? Number one is we need to flip the idea of the deficit, right? In other words, the deficit model thinking typically with education says they have the deficit. So the students who are not doing as well academically, the students who are not doing as well when they get out into the labor market and they're not finding jobs, there's obviously something wrong with them. Individually or culturally, their neighborhoods, their families, the cultures they come from are just not strong enough academically, not committed enough. Instead, we need to flip that mentality and realize the deficit is ours. It's a social deficit. It's a deficit that's been embedded in the society from the beginning. It was created very much on purpose. So it's not someone else's fault that they're not achieving at the same level. It's the system and society's fault for setting those folks up to fail by creating a system that was predicated on inequality. Once you have that mentality, once you realize that the deficit is ours collectively, not theirs individually, then it opens up a whole new world of possible policies, practices, and procedures that you could begin to think about that would plug the deficit on your end rather than trying to like fix the other people. A lot of times we do educational reform and it's sort of rooted in traditional deficit model thinking, which says we got to patch those people up. How can we fix their deficit? I remember when I was in college, there was, I went to Tulane in New Orleans, there was a volunteer organization, big, very popular group at Tulane for kids to join and to work with called Cactus, which I think stood for Community Action Council of Tulane University Students. And they would go out and do all types of volunteer and service-oriented work. And I mean, it's fine. But what was disturbing about it was how uncritical the analysis was, because they would go out and do things like, literacy for they'd go and teach seventh graders how to read in the New Orleans public schools who couldn't read. And on the one hand, it's like, okay, great, go do that by all means. But why is it that a seventh grader who's 12, right, 11 or 12 years old, whatever it is, when you're in seventh grade, how is it that kid doesn't know how to read yet? How do you get into seventh grade in a public school system in the richest nation on the face of the earth and not know how to read? Well, it's because the system didn't seem to care whether you learn that or not. So we're assuming the deficit is theirs and maybe we'll fix their deficit. But what about our deficit? Right? What about our systemic deficit that is producing that in the first place? And you can put Band-Aids on injuries all day long. You can even wrap them with real bandages and you can do triage on the patient to stop the bleeding, right? But at some point, you have to stop the source of the injury. So number one is flipping the idea of where the deficit resides. Number two is thinking about the importance of learning subjects that sometimes we neglect. Right now we're in this place where so many people around the country, including a lot of professional educators and political leaders, will talk about the importance of STEM subjects, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And I get it. We need those things. They weren't the things I was interested in, but God knows we need them. We need scientists to be able to figure out vaccines for things like COVID, right? We need technology to be able to have this conversation when there is something like COVID, right? We need engineers to keep the buildings from collapsing and the bridges from collapsing and the planes in the sky. I don't understand aviation, but engineers tell me it works, so I trust them, right? We need them. We need mathematicians. I knew I wasn't going to be one, but I'm glad there are other folks who understand that stuff. But here's the problem. As we move toward pushing young people in college into STEM fields, we're neglecting some things that are awfully important from the perspective of creating equity. Because we could get 20 years down the road, have a lot of really good tech people, have a lot of really good engineers, people who understand math and science, people who can code all kinds of apps for your phone and give us all kinds of new gadgets, but they may not have any idea how to maintain a pluralistic, multicultural, multiracial democracy, because there is no app for that, right? There is no app for democracy. There's no app for maintaining pluralism in a society just because you have wealth and technology and engineers and scientific know-how, right? You have to have an understanding of ethics. You have to have an understanding of history, right? And so I talk about the importance of what I call mesh subjects, not just STEM, but mesh. M for media literacy, because God knows right now we're being bombarded with so many media messages. I don't just mean the news, I mean advertisers, right? I mean social media imagery. Our kids are. I've got a 19 and a 17-year-old. They have emerged relatively unscathed from all of that technology and all of those media messages, but younger kids being bombarded even more than they were, they more than I was, and those older than myself. So we need media literacy. We need young people and not so young people to be able to discern the real from the fake, right? To be able to know when they're being sold a product and when people are lying to them, whether it's an advertiser or a politician. We need the E for ethics, right? To have these ethical discussions. We're in the midst of a awful pandemic, one of the sort of cornerstone moments in the history of this nation, if not the world. And we've got all these ethical dilemmas that we don't even know how to talk about. The ethical dilemma of, how much risk are we willing to take by reopening the economy? What's the ethical balance between making sure people have sources of income and making sure public health is maintained? These are really deep ethical conversations, but most people never engage in ethics discussions where they can even have that conversation, unless it's maybe in a religious institution, or maybe you're a philosophy major in college and you talk about ethics. But we need that as well, so people know how to debate and think about these issues. We need the S for sociology, right? What is sociology? It's the study of groups and the power dynamics between groups. If we don't understand sociology, we don't understand why we have these inequalities, whether it's in the schools, the justice system, the labor market, and it becomes easier for us to just assume that those inequalities are natural. If I understand and have a sociological imagination where I ask questions about how that happened, and I don't take for granted that it's normal, then maybe I can have a better sense of why things are the way they are. And the H is critical. We have awful history education in this country. We still have people who learn that George Washington cut down a cherry tree and told his daddy because he was just so damned honest. And of course, that story is an entire fabrication. It never happened, but we have kids who've learned that. Most of us learned that. And we have a president who now says he doesn't want us to talk about the history of enslavement. He doesn't want any schools using the 1619 Project from the New York Times, not because there is a particular thing that is wrong with the project, just that the discussion about enslavement, the discussion about systemic racism itself is verboten to some people. They just don't want to talk about the centrality of that, let alone the centrality of indigenous removal, let alone the centrality of cultural and physical genocide of indigenous bodies and communities. So we just ignore the real history, and then we wonder why folks aren't prepared when some of the same problems that have plagued us historically come back again. Because they do. These themes keep reemerging, right? Racial inequity is a recurring theme. It's sort of the background noise of every generation in American history, and we seem to keep missing that, probably because we don't teach it that way, right? So we need the mesh subjects as well as the STEM subjects, because otherwise we're not even going to be able to do the STEM correctly. Science and technology have been used and weaponized against people. And if we don't understand sociology and history, we won't know that. We won't know, for instance, that scientists were the ones who pushed for and obtained the sterilization of indigenous women and Black women in particular, and poor white women as well. About 70,000 Black and brown folks and thousands of white women as well were sterilized throughout the 20th century involuntarily by the state and by state agencies, right? Kept from being able to have children because the courts decided that they were too imbecilic or moronic, these are the words they would use to give birth, or that just happened to them in state-run hospitals, right? You had people who were stripped of their ability to bear children against their will, and it was done in the name of science. Some of the leading scientific thinkers and scholars in this country came up with these population control programs that many of us think the Nazis invented. Right? The sterilization programs, the eugenics programs, the creation of the so-called master race. But none of this was German, right? This was stuff that American scholars were coming up with in the late 1800s and first decade and a half of the 1900s, right? So if I know that history, then I understand that even the science education has to have a historical element. Even the science education has to be sociological. We have to blend those things, or else we're sending people out into the world in a way that they'll never be able to really take aim at inequalities. And then the final thing, before I take questions, is we have to ask the fundamental question: what is the purpose of schooling, right? We know what Woodrow Wilson said it was. We know what Thomas Jefferson said it was. We know what Bill Bennett implied that it was in that interview in 2000. We need to have a very different mentality. And the good news is we have a model for this mentality. It's actually the model that Black families had to develop during the years of segregation, but it's a model that all persons of color, and for that matter, working class white folks, could benefit from, the people who were most harmed by racial and class inequity in our educational system. It's a mentality that Teresa Perry, brilliant educational theorist, talks about as what she calls freedom for literacy and literacy for freedom. The idea that the purpose of literacy is freedom, is collective liberation. It isn't enough to be free, that is to say, not enslaved or oppressed. You have to be literate in order to be free, to be fully functional, to be truly free in a society. You have to have education, and that's its purpose. And under segregation, that was the mentality that Black communities had to develop. Because under segregation, they certainly, and any person of color under segregation, not just Black folks, although that's the context within which I came of age, was the post-segregation era in the American South. But if you're Black or brown under segregation, you had to develop this collective mindset, because to think of schooling as an individual thing, where the point was you go to school, you get an education, you get a good job, you move up the ladder, like under segregation, if you were Black and brown, that wasn't going to happen. So you couldn't think of education as having the function of helping you in an isolated way. It had to be a collective enterprise, right? Because it had to be sort of all of us or none of us. Either we're all going to rise or none of us are going to. And that's not to romanticize segregation. I'm not saying we want to go back to those days, but that mentality is a very important one. And when we integrated schools, at least in theory, because obviously in practice, they're often resegregated and re-isolated racially. But in theory, we integrated the bodies, but we didn't really integrate the mindset. And so what we did is we took folks of color who had been deliberately marginalized. We took working class and poor folks of all colors who had been deliberately marginalized. We put them all together and we say, the reason you're here is so you can get a good job. And then we send them out into a labor market that is not predicated on all of them being able to get a good job. We send them out into a labor market that doesn't have good jobs for all of them. So it's a setup, right? As opposed to saying, no, the reason you're here is not just that. The reason you're here is that the social uplift of your entire community is predicated on this. Right? And when Black folks and other folks of color were in those segregated schools learning that, there was a sort of radical, even revolutionary spirit to education. When you take that away and you replace it with an individualistic mentality, right? Now you're taking everyone and you're sort of isolating them. There's no longer that social, that radical, that revolutionary, transformative mentality. Now it's just about, I want to get an education so I can make something of myself, and to hell with the rest of you, right? We can't change systemic problems if we're all thinking as individuals. We can't challenge systemic inequity if we're all thinking about our own next move. And I meet educators all the time that'll tell young people, hey, it's really important to stay in high school, really important to go to college so you can get out of here and make something of yourself. But we only say that, of course, to poor folks, working class folks, Black and brown folks, so you can get out of your community and where you're from and make something of yourself. But that's a horrible thing to tell young people, right? Because what we're saying to them when we say that is, everywhere you're from, everybody you know, everything that you've ever known is broken and busted and awful. And your top goal in life ought to be to escape your background, to escape your family, to escape your village, to escape your community, to escape your, rural farm community outside of Nashville. There are plenty of working class white folks who, 5 generations of farmers. And when their kids decide they want to go to college, right, there's that mentality of, oh, well, you're going to think you're better than us now. And so therefore, there's not a sense of collective liberation. There's not a sense of saying, no, it's not about leaving. It's not about them going to college so they can leave. It's about them going to college, getting as much education as they can so they can uplift the whole community, right? And make it work for everybody. But we don't have that mentality. We've taken the hyper individual, we've layered that on top of communities that desperately need to have the collective mentality of the purpose of education. And then we're surprised when, having done that, we get the results that we get. We can't be surprised. So it's about thinking systemically, not individually. It's about recognizing the system itself was set up to produce inequality. Therefore, we have to rethink the system from the bottom up. It's about challenging some of the most deeply held assumptions in our country, in our culture. And it's about changing the idea of where the deficit resides. The deficit isn't in Black folks and indigenous folks and Latinx folks. It's not in poor folks and working class folks. It's in a system that creates inequality on the basis of those things. And once we do that, and once we mix that new mentality where we flip the idea of where the deficit resides with the curriculum needed to sustain that new mentality and help us move forward, and the larger analytical framework that says the purpose of schooling is collective uplift, now all of a sudden the ideas can start to flow a lot more freely, and we can begin to come up with policies, practices, and procedures that we perhaps hadn't thought of before because we were still operating on the old hardware, and using flawed software in the process. So obviously there are a ton of things that if we had the time, we could go deeply into detail about with regard to that. This was the amount of time that we had, and I appreciate having that time with you. I want to take some questions. I know there's a ton of things that we could discuss if we have more time to do so. Hopefully in the near future, this thing will be over with. The coronavirus will be done. We'll be able to get together in person, and we can then really reflect on how this can drill down into how this can operate at the institutional level. I'd love to be able to do that with you. Again, thank you for having me, and I will open myself to any questions that you might have. Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, Tim. A couple questions that I have, and the answer may be beyond the time that we have available to us, but what can a professor do in their classroom to start operationalizing some of the things that you're talking about to impact the decision or the institution and the students that are in front of them in their classroom?
Well, I think in the long run, the really important thing for in-class professors to be able to do, obviously, is to build relationships with students where they can really talk openly about these things. I think one of the ways that we do that, so that we have students who trust us, that they can come to us with these concerns and be taken seriously and really reflect on these and feel that we are mentors, not just teachers, but mentors and allies to them, is we've got to be transparent. I think one of the things that keeps the student from opening up entirely and being as transparent as they can be with each other and with us as educators is that, all they see is that person in front of the room who controls their grade. I mean, that's the person that has the power. And so sometimes you're very reserved around people who are in a position to judge you and judge you harshly. So if you're dealing with, racial disparity, if you're dealing with economic hardship, these are things you might not want to bring up. You don't know if that educator is going to be able to hear that. You don't know if that educator is going to be empathic to that or whether they're going to think you're just making excuses. On the other hand, if you're a dominant group student who, has biases, you don't know if you can really talk about those because then you might get judged by that professor for being biased. I think the educator always wants to start with themselves and open themselves up and sort of be vulnerable in that situation. So if I'm teaching in a classroom setting, I'm wanting to make sure everyone knows, hey, whatever problems we're identifying here, whether that's racial inequity, economic inequity, gender disparity, all the things that we know operate in the world, those things don't just affect you, they've affected me. I'm part of that world too. I've been conditioned to have the same stereotypical views about people that you have. I've been conditioned to have certain assumptions about people just like you have. We're all in this mess together. And that way, if I'm somebody who's struggling with those things, I'm going to be more likely to talk to you. If I talk about my own struggle with economic hardship, emotional or mental health issues, family, stuff, people that are struggling with family stuff, and sometimes that messes up their educational trajectory, they need to know that they're not alone in that. And every single one of us, as I said yesterday in the community event, we all come from dysfunctional families. Some of us are honest about it and some of us aren't, but very few of us come from true function, right? Most of us come from a mess, and it's valuable to actually be able to own that and to say, like, let me tell you, like, I get this, sometimes it is hard to show up and to always have your work done on time and to show up prepared to learn, because I've had those moments where I was not, and I have screwed up more times than I can count. If I let someone know that, I'm not saying that you don't hold people to expectations, but you got to talk about the fact that every one of us has faced some stuff that can be a really adverse experience that can set us back on our heels. And the more that we're transparent about that, I think the more people will open up and we'll be able to get the kind of trust that will allow students to engage in a much more forthright manner. And so I would start with that.
Very good. We're all looking for models of people that are a little further down the pathway than we are. Have you seen some institutions that you would point out that are doing this well, that maybe we could consult with, have conversations with?
Well, here's the thing. I'm always hesitant to ever throw too many accolades to any given institution, because as soon as I do that, next week they'll do something crazy and and go off the rail. I've had that happen before, where I've said, "Oh, there's this company and they're doing," and then literally like 6 weeks later they get sued for something horrific. But I will say this, without naming any names, there are institutions that I think have done good bits and pieces of this. I haven't seen any institutions sort of put the whole package together. So I've seen some schools that have done a really good job in terms of curricular reform and really the expectations that they place on the students in terms of what the students are expected to be exposed to in the course of the years that they're in undergrad, for instance. But then that same institution maybe isn't doing that great on, faculty hiring or tenuring process, or they might be doing well on the faculty piece, but they're not doing well. Their campus security, is applying the rules in a very disparate way. And so the Black and brown kids on the campus are still feeling like, really out of place. Or the school might be doing everything, not everything, but a lot of stuff right. And then the community becomes the problem, because I've had students of color in every state, and I've spoken in every state in the union, in every state tell me, hey, even when I'm comfortable on the campus, if I go off campus to recreate, to shop, to go out to eat, or if I'm looking for an apartment, maybe my junior year, move off campus or whatever, and I'm dealing with landlords that are, clearly racist, or I'm dealing with clerks that are racist, or people at the mall that are, it's like, you can't escape it. So the important thing is to make sure that the school is bringing in all these other stakeholders, local law enforcement, local real estate folks, local merchants, and having this conversation in a community-wide way, because it's not enough for a school to do everything right, even if you could, even if you did, if all the other people around are not part of that conversation, right? So I think we need to think in that holistic way.
Very good. Now, many of us listening to this probably have heard those stories of students being followed in Walmart. Mm-hmm. Because it's obvious they're not from around here.
Yeah.
So very good. Let's see, the last one, it's says, at this important time, what is the steps for our country as a whole? Maybe that's
I think, I talked about this a little yesterday, and it's a good place to wrap up our time today. Yeah. I think the community, from what we heard yesterday, is, maybe going to be going in this direction, which would be great. I think it could be a model for the country as a whole if you all did it, is to move in this direction that so many other places who are, trying to grapple with their history of oppression and even genocidal mistreatment of certain groups have done, which is a process of truth and reconciliation, or what I would prefer to call truth and justice commissions, where we really look at the disparities that have taken place at the localized level. Of course, South Africa did this post-apartheid. Rwanda did this after the genocide there in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s. Northern Ireland has looked at some of this. Germany, of course, has had a 80-year process, really a 75 to 80-year process of looking back at the history of Nazism and how Nazism came to be, and their own sort of role in that. And they've gone much further down that road than we have. So I think as a country, we need to be having that conversation nationally But I think it starts locally. It starts right there in Sitka, and in my case here in Nashville, with folks saying, hey, let's look at the history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's be honest about what has happened and what has brought us here. So like the land acknowledgement, very, very important. You all did that earlier, and I'm here on Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw land, folks who were run off largely by the 7th president of the United States, Andrew Jackson, whose home's about 25 minutes from where I am right now. And that's a good starting point. But once we do the acknowledgement of who was here and who is still here or there, right, we have to then also talk about what happened. The acknowledgement is the first step. Repairing the breach is the next step. And we can't repair the breach if we're not acknowledging the fullness of the history. And I think a lot of times we don't do that. And so I think that is a really important direction in which to go, because I think when we start talking about policies and politics, unless we have a common understanding of where the harm is, we're never going to be able to get that. And it doesn't mean that we have to do 100 years of education before we can do anything. We should be trying to do this simultaneous. But if we're not having, we can't operate on the assumption that everybody knows what has happened and they're just obtuse and not wanting to do what needs to be done. No, most people honestly are completely, not completely naive, but largely naive about the history of white supremacy and domination because we haven't taught it. And you can't know what you haven't been taught. And you can't teach what you weren't taught. We've had multiple generations of educators who themselves didn't learn this stuff. So we have to go back to square one. And I think that's a good place to start.
Very good. Well, Tim, on behalf of the University of Alaska Southeast campuses, including, of course, the Sitka campus that where I'm the director, thank you. I appreciate that you have injected your experience and your wisdom into an ongoing conversation that's occurring in Southeast Alaska. And so I look forward to learning more from you as I got me interested in learning more from your writing. And so again, thank you. And I want to let people know that the next of the series will be on Monday, the 14th. Dr. Amir Ahmad will be talking to us at noon, over the noon hour. So please avail yourself of this opportunity. And again, want to thank the folks that have helped sponsor this. I didn't talk about it at the beginning, the Complete to Compete Title III grant at the UAS Sitka campus, as well as the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, Social Services Department, Search, Sitka STEPS grant, and the Sitka Health Summit and Pathways Coalition. So a lot of good partners made this possible. Thank you for all of you that have participated. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues about the upcoming opportunities. Such an important conversation to be having. And just don't waste the opportunity that's presented to us. So I'm going to let you go. It's 11:02. Thank you. And Tim, again, thanks on behalf of the university. We really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.